The silence of the mountain was the first thing that greeted him when he returned to the world of the living. Not the comforting quiet of peace, but the vast, empty, and profoundly indifferent silence of a tomb. This is the story of a man the world threw away, and the forgotten place that gave him a reason to build a new one. If you believe in our mission to rescue these stories of courage, consider supporting us with a super thanks. And if you already stand with Elias, leave a "Stay Strong, Elias" in the comments below. The year was 1947, and the air in the high-altitude mining town of Prosperity, Colorado was thin and sharp, smelling of coal dust, pine, and the quiet desperation of men who gambled their lives for a weekly wage. Sergeant Elias Washington, late of the 761st Tank Battalion, was one of those men. He had returned from the war in Europe a hero, a man decorated for his courage and his almost supernatural skill with machinery. He had fought for his country with a fierce, unwavering loyalty, and he had come home believing, with the simple, honest faith of a soldier, that his country would honor its promise to him. But the promises of the GI Bill, the handshakes from politicians, the talk of a new, better world, all of it seemed to evaporate when faced with the color of his skin. The factory jobs went to the returning white soldiers. The doors of the universities were quietly, politely closed to him. The only work he could find was here, in the deep, dark and dangerous heart of the Atlas coal mine, a place that swallowed men's health and paid them just enough to keep them from starving. The tank he had once commanded, a roaring beast of American steel, had been replaced by a pickaxe and a shovel. It was a bitter, soul-crushing irony, but Elias was not a man given to self-pity. He was a soldier. He had his orders to survive. The Atlas mine and the town of Prosperity itself belonged to one man, Mr. Bartholomew Thorne. He was a man whose family had gotten rich from the mountain's bounty a generation ago, and who now ruled his small, isolated kingdom with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of a machine. Thorne was not a man given to malice. Malice required an emotional investment. He was a man of numbers, of ledgers, of profit and loss. His workers were not people. They were assets, entries on a spreadsheet, their value calculated against the cost of their upkeep and the price of coal on the open market. The collapse happened on a Tuesday, just after the midday shift change. It was not a dramatic explosion, but a low, groaning, and terrifyingly intimate sound. The sound of the earth giving up. A section of the main shaft, one that the foreman had been complaining about for months, its support timbers groaning under the immense weight of the mountain, simply surrendered. 1,000 tons of rock and earth came down in a deafening, dust-choked roar, sealing the deepest section of the mine, Section Gamma, from the rest of the world. 4 men were trapped, 4 men, including Elias Washington. Above ground, chaos erupted. The siren wailed its mournful, familiar song of disaster. Wives and children ran from their small, identical company houses, their faces pale with a terror that was a constant, unspoken resident of the town. The rescue effort began with a frantic, desperate energy. The other miners, their faces grim, attacked the wall of rock and debris with shovels and pickaxes, their own safety a distant secondary concern. Bartholomew Thorne arrived an hour later, not in work clothes, but in a tailored suit, his car a sleek, black anomaly in the dusty, chaotic scene. He did not speak to the weeping families. He conferred with his chief engineer, a nervous, sweat-stained man who held a set of blueprints. The news was bad. The collapse was deep, over a mile into the mountain. The shaft was unstable. To attempt a rescue would be a long, dangerous, and above all, expensive operation. It would require bringing in heavy equipment from Denver. It would mean shutting down the entire mine for weeks, maybe months. Thorne listened, his face a mask of cold financial calculation. He looked at the frantic, dirt-covered miners digging at the rock face. He looked at the weeping women, and he made a decision. It was not the decision of a leader of men. It was the decision of a CEO. "Stop the digging," he said, his voice quiet, but full of an authority that cut through the noise and the panic. "It's too dangerous. We'll lose more men. The shaft is a total loss." The foreman, a hard, decent man named Miller, stared at him in disbelief. "But sir," he stammered. "There are men down there. Elias Washington. He's one of them." "They're gone, Miller," Thorne said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "There's no oxygen. No one could have survived the collapse. They are a loss, a tragic one. But we will not compound that loss by sacrificing the living or the financial viability of this company. Seal the shaft permanently. We'll drill a new access tunnel to the lower veins from the west side. It's what we should have done years ago." It was a death sentence, delivered with the cold, impersonal logic of a balance sheet. The cost of rescuing 4 men was too high. It was cheaper, more efficient, to write them off, to bury them where they lay. The company would pay a small death benefit to the families, a token gesture of its sympathy, and then business would continue. The miners protested, their voices a roar of outrage. But what could they do? Thorne owned their jobs, their homes, their lives. The company guards, hard-faced men with clubs, moved in to enforce the order. The digging stopped. A heavy, defeated silence fell over the mouth of the mine. That evening, a team of engineers using concrete and steel began the work of sealing the shaft, turning the mine into a permanent, unmarked tomb. In the company records, Sergeant Elias Washington and 3 other men were officially and profitably declared dead. But Elias Washington was not dead. He was in hell. When the collapse happened, he had been thrown against a coal seam by the force of the blast, his leg caught and crushed by a falling timber. The pain was a white-hot, blinding agony. The air was a thick, suffocating soup of coal dust. But he was alive, and he was a soldier, and a soldier does not surrender. His military training, the years of discipline and survival skills that had been drilled into his very soul, took over. He fought back the pain. He assessed his situation. He was trapped, his leg was broken, and his air was running out. But he was not alone. One other miner, a young, terrified boy named Jimmy, was with him, trapped in the same small pocket of survival. For 2 days, Elias kept them both alive. He rationed the water from their canteens. He kept the boy from panicking, his calm, authoritative voice a steady anchor in the terrifying darkness. He tended to his own leg as best he could, splinting it with a piece of a broken shovel handle and strips of his own torn shirt. And he listened. He listened for the sound of rescue, for the telltale tapping, the distant sound of digging that would mean they had not been forgotten. On the 3rd day, the sound they heard was not the sound of rescue. It was the sound of construction, a distant, rhythmic hammering and the low rumble of machinery. They were not digging them out. They were sealing them in. The realization was a blow more devastating than any physical injury. They had been abandoned, left for dead, written off as a calculated loss. Jimmy, the young miner, began to sob, a deep, hopeless and soul-crushing sound in the darkness. But Elias did not break. The betrayal, the cold, murderous indifference of the world above did not extinguish the fire in him. It fanned it into a cold, hard, diamond-bright flame of pure, unadulterated rage. He would not die here. He would not give Thorne the satisfaction. He would not let this dark, suffocating tomb be the final chapter of his story. He remembered something an old miner had once told him, a story about the ghost tunnels, a network of old, abandoned shafts from a previous mining operation a generation ago. The company blueprints didn't show them, but they were there, a secret, forgotten labyrinth within the mountain. And he remembered seeing on a survey map an old, sealed ventilation shaft on the far northern face of the mountain, a place that was miles from the town, a place no one had gone to in 50 years. It was a 1 in a million chance, a desperate, insane gamble, but it was the only chance they had. Leaving the now catatonic Jimmy with the last of the water, Elias began to crawl, dragging his shattered leg behind him into the deeper, more ancient darkness of the mountain, searching for a ghost. Elias's journey through the mountain's forgotten veins was a descent into a primal, absolute darkness, a world devoid of light, of sound, of hope. He was not just crawling through a mine, he was navigating the underworld, a ghost in a land of ghosts. The pain from his leg was a constant, searing agony, a white-hot fire that threatened to consume his consciousness. But he refused to surrender to it. He channeled it, transformed it into a fuel for his rage, his stubborn, unyielding will to live. He was a soldier on his most desperate mission. The enemy was not a foreign army, but the very earth itself, and the cold, indifferent cruelty of the man who had buried him alive. His only tools were his hands, his encyclopedic knowledge of machinery and structures, and the ironclad discipline that had been forged in the crucible of war. He moved by touch, his calloused fingers reading the language of the rock, searching for the telltale signs of a different kind of construction, a different era of mining. He was searching for a change in the texture of the walls, for the remnants of older hand-hewn timbers, for the subtle shift in the air that would indicate an intersecting tunnel. Hours bled into what he guessed were days. He lost all track of time. His world shrank to the small, immediate circle of his own struggle, the next yard of rock to be crawled over, the next wave of pain to be endured, the next sip of the foul, mineral-tasting water he found dripping from a rock face, a slow, life-giving IV from the heart of the mountain. He found the first of the ghost tunnels on what he estimated was his second day of crawling. It was a narrow, low-ceilinged shaft, barely wide enough for his shoulders, the walls bearing the unmistakable scalloped marks of a pickaxe. This was the work of the old-timers, the Cornishmen and the Irish who had first attacked this mountain a century ago. A surge of desperate, triumphant hope surged through him. The old stories were true. There was a way out. He followed the ancient tunnel, a winding, labyrinthine path that seemed to lead ever deeper into the mountain's core. He was guided by an almost preternatural sense of direction, his engineer's mind creating a three-dimensional map of the mountain from memory, from the old survey charts he had studied. He was heading north, toward the abandoned, forgotten face of the mountain, toward the faint, one-in-a-million hope of the old ventilation shaft. He found Jimmy's body on the third day. The young miner had not tried to follow him. He had simply given up, curled into a fetal position, his canteen empty, his spirit broken. Elias paused for a moment, a wave of profound, weary sorrow washing over him. He closed the boy's eyes, a final, simple act of respect. He could not carry the boy's body, but he could carry his memory, a silent, damning testament to the crime that had been committed. He took the boy's empty canteen and his pickaxe, and he moved on. On the fourth day, his own hope began to falter. The tunnel he was following ended in a solid wall of rock, a cave-in, old and ancient, that had happened decades, perhaps a century ago. It was a dead end. The despair that hit him was a physical blow, more painful than the agony in his leg. He had been so close. He lay there in the darkness, the cold of the rock seeping into his bones, and for the first time, he allowed himself to think of death. He thought of his mother, of the girl he had loved before the war, of the life he had never had a chance to live. But then he thought of Bartholomew Thorne. He pictured the man's cold, calculating eyes, his dismissive, indifferent expression, and the rage returned, a hot, life-giving fire. He would not die here. He would not give that man the satisfaction. He would claw his way out of this mountain with his bare hands if he had to. He began to crawl back, retracing his path, searching for an intersecting tunnel, another path he might have missed. And as he did, he felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible movement of the air against his cheek, a draft. It was the first time he had felt a current in the stagnant, dead air of the mine. A draft meant a connection to the outside world. It meant an opening. It meant life. He followed the draft, a tiny, invisible thread of hope in the absolute darkness. It led him to another, even older tunnel, a narrow, winding shaft that began to slope steeply upwards. He began to climb, dragging his shattered leg behind him, the pickaxe his only anchor, his fingers and elbows raw and bleeding. The air grew fresher, colder. He could smell it now, the faint, clean, unmistakable scent of pine and rain-washed earth. He saw the light before he reached it, a small, impossibly distant circle of pale grey light, no bigger than a silver dollar. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He clawed his way toward it, his body screaming in protest, his mind focused on that single beautiful point of light. He emerged, not into a shaft, but onto a small, narrow ledge on the face of a sheer cliff. The ventilation shaft had collapsed years ago, leaving only this small, precarious opening. He was out. He was out of the darkness. He gulped in the thin, cold mountain air, the purity of it a shock to his coal dust-ravaged lungs. He was on the far northern face of the mountain, a wild, inaccessible wilderness of rock and pine. Below him was a sheer, 1,000-foot drop. Above him was nothing but bare, unforgiving rock. He was out of the mine, but he was trapped on a cliff face in the middle of a vast, empty wilderness. He lay on that ledge for a day, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion, the pain, and the starvation. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a blur of grey rock and a vast, indifferent sky. He was a man who had escaped his own tomb, only to find himself in a new, more open, and equally deadly prison. He was saved by a ghost, an old prospector, a man named Silas, who lived a hermit's life in the high mountains, one of the last of a dying breed of men who still believed the mountain held a secret bounty. Silas was checking his traps when he saw something, a flash of movement on a cliff face that should have been empty. His old, sharp eyes saw what looked like a bundle of rags, and then he saw an arm move. It took Silas the better part of a day to make his way to the ledge, using a network of ancient, forgotten game trails. He found Elias, half dead, his leg a swollen, discolored mess, his lips cracked and bleeding. The old prospector, a man who had not spoken to another human being in over a year, simply grunted, hoisted the impossibly heavy soldier onto his own wiry, surprisingly strong back, and began the long, slow, arduous journey back to his cabin. The cabin was a small, rude structure of logs and mud, tucked into a hidden high-altitude valley, a place that did not appear on any map. For the next month, this tiny, forgotten cabin became Elias's hospital, his sanctuary, and his place of rebirth. Silas was not a doctor, but he was a man who knew the hard, practical medicine of the mountains. He set Elias's leg, the pain of it so intense that Elias passed out. He cleaned the wound with whiskey. He made a poultice of herbs and moss to draw out the infection. He fed Elias a thin, nourishing broth made from a rabbit he had snared. For weeks, Elias hovered in a twilight world between life and death. He was racked by fever, haunted by nightmares of the darkness, of the collapse, of the face of the boy he had left behind. Silas tended to him with a quiet, gruff, and unwavering dedication. The two men, the old white hermit and the young, black soldier, two of the world's forgotten solitary souls, formed a strange, silent, and profound bond. Slowly, painfully, Elias began to heal. The fever broke. The wound in his leg began to close. The strength began to return to his limbs. As he recovered, he began to see the world around him with new eyes. He saw the breathtaking, savage beauty of the hidden valley. He saw the quiet, self-sufficient dignity of the old man who had saved him. Silas lived a life that was completely, utterly independent of the world below. He grew his own food. He hunted for his meat. He drank the pure, clean water from the mountain stream. He was a man who was owned by no one, who was beholden to nothing but the seasons and the rhythms of the earth. For Elias, a man who had spent his entire life in systems, the sharecropping system of the South, the rigid hierarchy of the army, the feudal oppression of the company town, this vision of a life of absolute radical freedom was a revelation. As he grew stronger, he began to help Silas. His engineer's mind saw 100 ways to improve the old man's simple, rustic existence. He saw that the cabin's chimney drew poorly. He redesigned the flue, and for the first time in years, the cabin was filled with warmth instead of smoke. He saw the inefficient way Silas hauled water from the stream. He devised a simple but brilliant water wheel, using the materials at hand that could power a pump and bring the water directly to the cabin. He was, once again, a builder, a problem solver, but he was not working for a company or for an army. He was working for himself, for his own survival, for the small two-person community he had found in this hidden corner of the world. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it was his own. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging to a place that he had never known. But the ghost of the world below, the memory of the crime that had been committed, the face of Bartholomew Thorne, was a constant, gnawing presence. He had survived. But survival was not enough. He was a soldier, and he had a final mission to complete. He had a war to win. He had made a silent promise to the memory of the boy he had left in the darkness. He would not let Thorne get away with it. He had found a place that had saved his body, but to save his soul, he knew he had to go back. He had to return from the dead, and he had to bring a reckoning with him. The mountain air was a powerful, healing tonic. With each passing week, Elias felt his strength returning, a slow, deep tide rising within him. The bone in his leg began to knit, the raw wound closing into a clean, hard scar. He began to walk again, at first with a crude crutch Silas had fashioned from a pine branch, then with a limp that grew less pronounced each day. He would never be the man he was before. The leg would always be a stiff, aching reminder of his time in the tomb. But he was alive, and his mind, his engineer's mind, was sharper and clearer than ever. The hidden valley became his training ground, his rehabilitation camp. He and Silas fell into a comfortable, productive routine, a silent partnership of two self-sufficient men. Elias, with his boundless ingenuity, continued to transform their small, rustic world. The water wheel he had built was a masterpiece of salvaged parts and brilliant design. It not only pumped water to the cabin, but with a few modifications, a series of gears carved from hardwood, a belt fashioned from a tanned deer hide. It also powered a small grindstone for sharpening their tools, and even a rudimentary trip hammer for Silas's small forge. Elias was a force of the modern world, a man who understood the principles of mechanics and physics, and he was applying them to this ancient, timeless landscape. Silas, in turn, was his teacher in a different kind of knowledge. He taught Elias the language of the mountain, how to read the tracks of a deer, how to predict the weather from the behavior of the birds, how to find the hidden seams of quartz and fool's gold that ran through the granite. They were two men from two different centuries, two different Americas, and in their shared, quiet world, they had found a deep, unspoken and profound respect for each other. But even in this peaceful, isolated sanctuary, the ghost of prosperity and of Bartholomew Thorne was a constant, haunting presence. Every night, Elias would dream of the darkness, of the suffocating dust, of the sound of the miners being sealed in their tomb. He had survived, but his survival felt incomplete, a hollow victory, as long as the man responsible for the crime was living a life of comfort and profit. His crime not just unpunished, but unacknowledged. Elias knew he had to go back, but he also knew he could not simply walk back into prosperity. To the world, he was a dead man. To suddenly reappear would be to create a sensation, a 9 days wonder that Thorne and his lawyers would quickly spin and discredit. They would paint him as a madman, a fraud, a ghost conjured up to extort money from the benevolent company. He needed more than just his own testimony. He needed proof. He needed a weapon. He began to think not as a survivor, but as a soldier planning a campaign. He needed intelligence. He needed to understand the enemy's defenses, and he needed to find an ally on the inside. His plan began to form, a slow, patient, and incredibly risky strategy. He knew that the key to Thorne's undoing lay not in an appeal to justice or morality, but in an attack on the one thing Thorne truly valued, his money. The Atlas coal mine was the source of his wealth, and it was there that his greatest vulnerability must lie. Elias began to make quiet, careful reconnaissance trips down the mountain. He would leave before dawn, his limp now a steady, manageable rhythm, and make his way down the forgotten game trails to the outskirts of prosperity. He would hide in the woods that overlooked the town, watching, observing, gathering intelligence. He saw that the town had moved on. A small, sad monument had been erected in the town square, a simple stone obelisk with the names of the 4 lost miners carved into it, his own name among them. It was a cheap, cynical gesture, a public performance of a grief that Thorne did not feel. The mine was running again, more profitably than ever, with the new, efficient western shaft in full operation. The world had forgotten him. He needed a way to get a message to the one man in town he thought he could trust. Miller, the foreman, the man who had argued with Thorne, who had tried to continue the rescue, but to approach him directly was too dangerous. His opportunity came in an unexpected form. He observed that once a week, a supply truck made the long journey up a winding mountain road to a remote radio relay station on one of the high peaks. The driver was a young man who was known to be careless, often stopping for a drink at a tavern on his way back down, leaving his truck unattended. Elias, using the skills he had learned in the war, staged a quiet, professional hijacking. He didn't steal the truck, he borrowed it. While the driver was in the tavern, Elias, his face hidden by a low-pulled cap, hot-wired the vehicle and drove it up a deserted logging road. In the back of the truck, under a tarp, was a crate of old discarded radio equipment being sent back for salvage. Among the junk was a fully functional, if outdated, shortwave radio transmitter and receiver. It was exactly what he needed. He unloaded the equipment, drove the truck back to the tavern, and disappeared into the night. Back in the hidden valley, he and Silas set up the radio. For Elias, the complex machinery was as familiar and as comforting as an old friend. He tinkered with the vacuum tubes, he resoldered the connections, he erected a long wire antenna between two tall pine trees. Within a day, he had a fully operational, clandestine listening post. He began to monitor the mine's radio frequencies. He listened to the chatter of the foreman, the dispatchers, the engineers. He was gathering a pattern of life, a picture of the mine's operations. And as he listened, he began to hear things, small, careless comments, fragments of conversations that hinted at a deeper, more pervasive rot in Thorne's operation. He heard foremen complaining about faulty equipment, about a lack of safety gear, about pressure from the front office to cut corners, to mine the seams too quickly, to ignore the groaning of the support timbers. The collapse in Section Gamma had not been an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a systemic, company-wide culture of negligence, a culture that was driven by one thing: Thorne's relentless, insatiable greed. The man had learned nothing. He was still gambling with his workers' lives, and it was only a matter of time before another disaster, another collapse happened. Elias now had his weapon. He had the evidence, in the form of the radio chatter, that the mine was a death trap, but he still needed a way to deliver the blow. He decided to make contact with Miller, the foreman. Using the shortwave radio, he began to broadcast a simple, coded message on an unused frequency, a frequency he knew the mine's radio operators would be unlikely to monitor. It was a simple, repeating sequence of numbers, a code he and Miller had used in the army, a unit designation from their time in the war. It was a call sign from a ghost, a message that only one man in the world would understand. For a week, he broadcast the message every night for 10 minutes at a time. He didn't know if Miller would hear it, if he would even remember the old code. It was a shot in the dark, a desperate hope, and then, one night, he got a response, a simple 3-number sequence crackling back through the static. It was Miller's old squad number. The foreman had heard him. The ghost had made contact. Over the next few weeks, they communicated in a series of short, clandestine, coded radio transmissions. Elias, his voice disguised by a piece of cloth over the microphone, instructed Miller. He told him what to look for, what documents to copy, what conversations to listen for. He was turning the foreman into his intelligence agent, his spy on the inside. Miller, a decent man who had been living with a heavy burden of guilt and a simmering, helpless anger since the day of the collapse, was a willing, if terrified, co-conspirator. He began to gather the evidence Elias needed. He copied shipping manifests that showed Thorne was selling a lower grade of coal than he was advertising, a clear case of fraud. He documented the safety violations. He took photographs of the cracked support timbers. He made a list of every complaint that had been ignored, every corner that had been cut. They were building a case, a meticulous, irrefutable indictment of Bartholomew Thorne and his entire corrupt operation. But they knew that this evidence, presented to the local, company-controlled sheriff, would be useless. They needed to get it to a higher authority, an outside agency that could not be bribed or intimidated. Their target was the Federal Bureau of Mines, a powerful government agency based in Washington, D.C., an agency that had the power to shut down unsafe unsafe mines and to bring criminal charges against their owners. The final piece of their plan was the most dangerous. They needed to get Miller's evidence, a thick manila envelope of documents and photographs, out of Prosperity and into the hands of a trusted contact who could deliver it to Washington. Elias, the ghost of the mountain, would be the courier. The rendezvous was set for a moonless night at a deserted crossroads miles outside of town. Miller was to leave the envelope under a specific marked stone. Elias was to retrieve it and be gone before dawn. But something went wrong. Thorne, a man who had built his empire on suspicion and a network of paid informants, had apparently heard rumors of Miller's descent. He had been having the foreman followed. As Elias, moving silently through the woods, approached the crossroads, he saw it. A car, its lights off, was parked in the shadows. Two of Thorne's guards were waiting. It was an ambush. Miller was walking into a trap. Elias had a choice. He could retreat, disappear back into the safety of his mountain sanctuary, and leave Miller to his fate. Or he could intervene, expose himself, and risk everything. He did not hesitate. He was a soldier, and you do not leave a man behind. The sight of the ambush at the crossroads sent a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline through Elias's veins. He dropped to a crouch behind a thicket of pine, his mind instantly shifting from that of a courier to a combatant. Two of Thorne's men, burly figures he recognized from the mine's security force, were leaning against their car, smoking cigarettes, their forms barely visible in the faint starlight. They were positioned perfectly, with a clear line of sight to the deserted road where Miller would be arriving. It was a classic, brutally simple trap. Elias's mind raced, assessing the tactical situation. He was unarmed, save for the heavy, perfectly balanced pickaxe he always carried, a tool that had become an extension of his own arm. He was outnumbered, and he was still not at full strength. His leg, though healed, was a source of a deep, aching weakness. A direct physical confrontation would be suicidal. He had to be smarter. He had to use the terrain, the darkness, and the element of surprise. He had one crucial advantage. He was a ghost. They did not know he was there. They were waiting for Miller, a predictable target who would be walking into their trap completely unaware. He faded back into the deep woods, circling wide around the crossroads, his movements as silent and as fluid as a shadow. He was in his element here. The mountain, which had once been his prison, was now his greatest ally. He knew its every fold, every game trail, every rock and ravine. He made his way to a position on the high ground, a rocky outcropping that overlooked the road about 100 yards before the crossroads. From here, he could intercept Miller before he reached the ambush. He didn't have to wait long. He heard the faint crunch of gravel on the road below, the sound of a man walking with a determined, steady stride. It was Miller. Elias let out a low, sharp whistle, the call of a nighthawk, a signal they had used in the war to signal danger. Miller stopped dead in his tracks. He stood frozen on the dark road, his head cocked, listening. Elias whistled again. Miller immediately understood. He melted off the road and into the shadows of the trees. "Elias?" he whispered into the darkness, his voice a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Here!" Elias's voice came from the rocks above him. "Up here, quietly. You walked into a reception committee." Miller scrambled up the rocky incline, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He found Elias crouched in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the crossroads below. "They were waiting for me," Miller breathed, the realization dawning on him. "Thorne knows. He suspects," Elias corrected him, his voice a low, calm whisper. "He doesn't know about me. He just knows you're a problem he needs to solve." "Did you bring it?" Miller nodded, clutching the thick manila envelope to his chest. "It's all here. The manifests, the safety reports, the photos." "Good," Elias said. "Now the plan has changed. We're not just delivering a message anymore. We're starting the war tonight." Elias's mind was working with a cold, brilliant clarity. The ambush had been a setback, but it was also an opportunity. Thorne had overplayed his hand. He had revealed his willingness to use violence, to operate outside the law, and he had, unknowingly, brought the two key figures of the resistance together. "They're expecting you to to show up at that crossroads, Elias said, his mind formulating a new, audacious plan. So we're going to give them a surprise somewhere else. While they're sitting here, waiting for a mouse, we're going to burn down their house. He was not speaking literally. He was speaking as a soldier. They were going to launch a preemptive strike, not against Thorn's men, but against the source of his power, the mine itself. The new western shaft, Elias said, his voice low and intense. That's his pride and joy. That's the most profitable, most efficient part of his whole operation. It's also the most vulnerable. It relies on a single massive electrical generator to run the ventilation fans, the water pumps, and the main hoist. If that generator were to go down, the entire western section would be paralyzed. It would cost him thousands of dollars for every hour it was shut down. It would be a blow he couldn't hide. Miller stared at him in the darkness, his eyes wide. "You're talking about sabotage," he whispered, the word a taboo, a sacrilege in a town that lived and died by the mine. "I'm talking about justice, Miller," Elias said, his voice hard as iron. "Thorn buried 4 men alive and wrote them off as a business expense. He is running a death trap that is going to kill more men. We are not destroying his property. We are disabling a weapon, and we are going to do it in a way that doesn't hurt a single living soul." Elias's plan was a masterpiece of engineering and tactical brilliance. The main generator was housed in a small brick building near the mouth of the new shaft. It was a massive, complex piece of machinery, the heart of the mine. A crude attack, an explosion, would be disastrous and would turn public opinion against them. But Elias was not a crude saboteur. He was an engineer. He knew the machine's weaknesses, its delicate, intricate vulnerabilities. He explained his plan to Miller. The generator was cooled by a closed-loop water system. If that system were to be compromised, if the water were to be drained, the generator would overheat and automatically shut itself down. There was an emergency drainage valve, a simple hand-cranked wheel located on an external pipe. It was a safety feature designed for maintenance. It was also the machine's Achilles heel. "While those 2 thugs are waiting at the crossroads," Elias said, "you and I are going to pay a visit to Mr. Thorn's generator. We'll open the valve, drain the coolant, and by the time anyone realizes what's happened, the machine will be shut down and will be long gone. The night shift will be evacuated, the mine will be paralyzed, and Thorn will have a very, very expensive problem on his hands." But that was only the first part of his plan. The second part was even more audacious. "Tomorrow morning," Elias continued, "when the whole town is in an uproar, you, Miller, are going to walk into the sheriff's office. You're going to tell him that you have evidence of gross safety negligence at the mine. You're going to tell him that you believe the generator shutdown was an act of God, a warning, a sign that the mine is cursed. And you are going to leak a copy of this evidence," he tapped the manila envelope, "to the one newspaper reporter in the state who can't be bought. A man I know in Denver. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. They would use the town's own superstitions, its deep-seated, almost medieval fear of the mountain against Thorn. The shutdown would not be seen as a crime, but as a judgment. And Miller, who would come forward as a brave whistleblower, would be seen as a hero, a man of conscience trying to prevent a greater disaster. Miller, who had been a man living in a state of quiet, fearful desperation, was now caught up in the sheer, magnetic force of Elias's will. He was no longer a frightened informant. He was a soldier, a co-conspirator in a righteous cause. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm with a new, hard-won courage. They made their way, under the cover of the deep woods, to the outskirts of the western shaft. The generator house was exactly as Elias had remembered it from the blueprints, a small, humming brick building, a single bare light bulb burning over the door. The area was deserted. The night shift was deep in the mountain, and the only security was the 2 men waiting at the crossroads, miles away. Elias and Miller slipped out of the woods and into the shadows of the building. Elias located the drainage valve, its wheel crusted with rust. It took the strength of both men to turn it, the old metal groaning in protest, and then they heard it, a low, gurgling sound, as the thousands of gallons of coolant began to drain out of the system and into the surrounding earth. Their work done, they slipped back into the woods, two ghosts in the night. They parted ways with a silent, firm handshake. Miller was to return to his home, to be found sleeping in his bed, an innocent man who had been nowhere near the mine. Elias was to return to his mountain sanctuary, the ghost returning to his lair. He reached his hidden valley just before dawn, his body aching, his shattered leg a throbbing agony, but his heart was alight with a cold, fierce and triumphant fire. He had struck the first blow. He had not just survived, he was fighting back. He did not have to wait long to see the results of his work. From his high vantage point, he saw the first signs of chaos in the town below. He saw the flicker of emergency lights, the headlights of trucks moving frantically toward the western shaft. He saw the men of the night shift, their faces pale and confused, emerging from the mouth of the mine. Later that day, listening on his shortwave radio, he heard the news. The main generator at the Atlas mine had suffered a catastrophic and inexplicable failure. The entire western section of the mine was shut down indefinitely. The company engineers were baffled. There was no sign of an explosion, no sign of forced entry. The machine had simply died. And then he heard the second piece of news, broadcast on the local radio station. The mine foreman, a respected long-time employee named Frank Miller, had come forward with shocking allegations of safety violations at the mine, claiming the generator failure was a warning from God. The Denver Post, the report said, had just published a front-page story with damning evidence of fraud and negligence at the Atlas mine, prompting an immediate, high-level investigation by the Federal Bureau of Mines. Elias sat back, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. The war had begun. The ghost of the mountain had spoken, and the world below was finally, irrevocably, forced to listen. Bartholomew Thorne's perfect, profitable, and murderous world was beginning to crumble. The shutdown of the Western Shaft and the publication of the Denver Post article hit prosperity like an earthquake. The carefully constructed world of Bartholomew Thorne, a world built on a foundation of fear, silence, and absolute control, began to shake. For the first time, the narrative was not his to control. The story of the inexplicable generator failure, coupled with Miller's prophetic warning, took root in the fertile soil of the miners' deep-seated superstitions. It was no longer a mechanical issue. It was a matter of cosmic justice. The mountain, they whispered in the taverns and on the street corners, was angry. It was claiming its due for the 4 men who had been left to die in its belly. Thorne, a man of cold, rational logic, was completely unprepared for this kind of asymmetrical warfare. He could fight a union, he could bribe a politician, he could silence a foreman, but he did not know how to fight a ghost story. He issued statements, he brought in engineers from Denver, he offered a reward for any information about sabotage, but his efforts were useless. The town had found a new, more powerful narrative, one that resonated with their deepest fears and their oldest beliefs. The arrival of the federal investigators a week later was the aftershock that brought Thorne's walls crumbling down. They were not the local, compliant officials he was used to. They were sharp, humorless, and utterly incorruptible men from Washington, D.C. They came armed with copies of Miller's documents and a mandate to uncover the truth, no matter how powerful the man it implicated. They sealed Thorne's offices, they impounded his records, and they began a series of in-depth private interviews with the miners. Miller, who was now being hailed as a hero, a man of conscience, was their star witness. But he was no longer the only one. Spurred on by his courage and by the growing belief that the tide was finally turning, other miners began to come forward, their years of apathetic, fearful silence finally broken. They spoke of the faulty equipment, of the ignored safety complaints, of the constant, relentless pressure to put production ahead of human life. The dam of fear that had held the town in its grip for a generation had burst, and a flood of long-suppressed truth came pouring out. From his mountain sanctuary, Elias monitored the unfolding revolution on his radio. He was a ghost, an unseen, unknown force, but he was the architect of it all. He had not just brought a reckoning, he had given the town back its voice. He had reminded them that their collective strength was more powerful than one man's greed. But his work was not yet done. The federal investigation was a powerful weapon, but he knew that Thorne would not go down without a fight. He would use his lawyers, his political connections, to try to obstruct, to delay, to bury the investigation in a mountain of legal paperwork. Elias knew he had one final, devastating card to play: himself, the testimony of a dead man. He spent the next few weeks preparing for his return. He was still a ghost, a man with no official existence. He needed to re-enter the world in a way that was strategic, powerful, and undeniable. He used the radio to communicate with his one trusted contact in the outside world, the reporter from the Denver Post who had broken the story, a fearless, crusading journalist named Ben Carter. In a series of clandestine late-night transmissions, Elias told Carter the full, incredible story. He spoke of the collapse, of the betrayal, of his impossible subterranean journey, of his rescue by the old prospector. He told him of the boy, Jimmy, who had been left to die. It was a story of survival, of injustice, of a crime so monstrous it was almost unbelievable. Carter was stunned. He had thought he was covering a story of corporate negligence. He now realized he was in the middle of a story of attempted murder. "I need you to arrange something for me, Mr. Carter." Elias's disguised voice crackled over the radio. "I need you to arrange a public hearing, a town meeting. I want the federal investigators there. I want the press there. And I want Bartholomew Thorne there. I am going to give my testimony in public, in front of the whole world." It was an audacious, high-stakes gamble. By revealing himself, Elias would be making himself vulnerable. Thorne's lawyers would try to destroy his credibility, to paint him as a liar, a fraud. But Elias knew that the power of his story, the simple, devastating truth of his resurrection, would be a weapon against which they had no defense. Carter, recognizing the story of a lifetime, agreed. He used his influence and the pressure of the ongoing federal investigation to force the issue. A public hearing was scheduled to be held in the Prosperity Town Hall under the auspices of the Bureau of Mines. On the day of the hearing, the town was buzzing with an electric, nervous energy. The small town hall was packed to the rafters with miners, with their families, with reporters from newspapers and radio stations across the state. Bartholomew Thorne was there, seated at a table with his team of expensive, stone-faced lawyers, his face a mask of arrogant, defiant contempt. The hearing began with the lead federal investigator laying out the preliminary findings of their investigation, the safety violations, the fraudulent records. Thorne's lawyers objected. They obfuscated. They tried to drown the proceedings in a sea of legal jargon. And then the investigator called his final witness. "I now call to the stand," he said, his voice ringing out in the silent, crowded room, "a man you all believed to be dead. I call Mr. Elias Washington." The back door of the town hall opened, and Elias walked in. The room erupted in a collective, involuntary gasp of disbelief. People stood up, they pointed, they whispered. It was him. It was the ghost of the mountain, returned from the grave. He was thinner, his face was scarred. He walked with a pronounced, painful limp, but it was unmistakably him. He was alive. He walked slowly, deliberately, down the central aisle, his gaze fixed on one man, Bartholomew Thorne. Thorne stared at him, his face draining of all color, his arrogant composure shattering into a million pieces. He was looking at a ghost, at the living, breathing embodiment of his own monstrous crime. Elias took the stand. He raised his right hand, and he swore an oath on the Bible. And then, in a low, clear, and steady voice that carried to every corner of the silent, spellbound room, he began to tell his story. He spoke of the darkness. He spoke of the fear. He spoke of the hope of rescue and the soul-crushing despair of hearing the sounds of his own tomb being sealed. He spoke of the young boy, Jimmy, who had died in his arms, a victim not of a mountain, but of a balance sheet. He spoke of his impossible journey, of his rescue, of his slow return to the world of the living. He did not speak with anger or with hatred. He spoke with a quiet, devastating, and irrefutable dignity. He was not a victim seeking pity. He was a soldier, a witness, delivering his after-action report. He was giving his testimony not just for himself, but for the men who had been lost, for the community that had been terrorized, for the simple, fundamental principle that a man's life is worth more than a ton of coal. As he spoke, the town of Prosperity was transformed. The years of fear, of silence, of apathetic submission were burned away by the sheer, incandescent power of his truth. The women in the audience wept, not for the tragedy, but for the profound, heartbreaking courage of the man who had survived it. The miners, his brothers, looked at him with a mixture of awe and shame and a new dawning sense of their own power. When he had finished, a profound, cathedral-like silence filled the room. All eyes turned to Bartholomew Thorne. He sat shrunken in his chair, a broken, defeated man, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He had been tried and convicted, not by a jury of his peers, but by the testimony of the man he had left for dead. Elias's testimony was the final, fatal blow. The federal investigation, now armed with the eyewitness account of an attempted murder, moved from a civil inquiry to a full-blown criminal case. Bartholomew Thorne was arrested, his empire crumbled, and he would spend the rest of his life in a prison, a tomb of his own making. The Atlas coal mine was taken over by the federal government and was eventually sold to a new, responsible owner who worked in partnership with the newly empowered miners' union to create a safe and just workplace. The town of Prosperity, freed from the grip of its tyrant, began the long, slow process of healing, of rebuilding, of becoming a community in the truest sense of the word. Elias Washington, the man who had been at the center of it all, did not stay. He had completed his mission. He had won his war. The town, in its gratitude, offered him a pension, a position of honor, a lifetime of comfort, but he refused. He had not done it for a reward. He had done it because it was his duty. He returned one last time to the hidden valley in the high mountains, to the small rustic cabin, to the company of the old silent prospector who had been his savior. He had found in that forgotten, isolated place something he had never known in the world below, a sense of peace, a sense of freedom, a sense of home. He had been abandoned by the world, left to die in the darkness. But in the heart of a mountain, he had found a place of light, a place that had not just saved his life, but had given him a new one. He was the ghost of the mountain, the soldier who had returned from the dead. And in his quiet, dignified and honorable life, he had become a legend, a testament to the enduring, uncrushable power of the human spirit. Elias's return to the mountain was not an escape, but a choice. He had faced the world, had spoken his truth, and had seen justice done. Now he was choosing a different kind of life, a life of quiet, deliberate, and profound simplicity. The world below, with its noise, its greed, its endless, wearying conflicts, no longer held any appeal for him. He had found his peace in the high, thin, and honest air of the mountains, and he had no desire to leave it again. He and Silas, the old prospector, resumed their quiet, companionable existence in the hidden valley. Theirs was a friendship built not on words, but on a deep, unspoken foundation of mutual respect. They were two men who had, for different reasons, turned their backs on the world and had found in each other's solitary company a strange and satisfying kind of community. But the world, as much as Elias tried to leave it behind, was not yet finished with him. The story of the ghost of Prosperity, the soldier who had returned from the dead to bring down a tyrant, had captured the imagination of the nation. Ben Carter's articles in the Denver Post had been syndicated across the country, and the tale of Elias Washington had become a kind of modern-day folk legend, a story of courage, survival, and a righteous, Old Testament-style reckoning. People began to make their way to prosperity, not for the coal, but for the story. They were journalists, writers, historians, ordinary people who had been moved by his incredible journey. They came looking for the hero, for the ghost of the mountain. They found a town that was in the midst of a quiet, hopeful rebirth, a community that spoke of Elias Washington with a hushed, reverent awe. But the man himself was gone, vanished back into the wilderness from which he had come. The town, in its own way, protected his solitude. They had been given a second chance, a chance to build a decent, honorable community, and they knew they owed that chance to the man who had asked for nothing in return. When the outsiders came asking for directions to the hidden valley, the people of prosperity would just shake their heads. "There are some places on this mountain that are best left alone," they would say, their faces unreadable masks. They were guarding their hero's peace, their final collective act of gratitude and respect. But one visitor, a year after the trial, did manage to find her way to him. She was not a journalist or a historian. She was a young woman with a quiet, determined face and a limp that was almost identical to his own. Her name was Sarah Miller, the daughter of the foreman who had been his ally in the fight against Thorn. Sarah had been a teacher in a small school on the eastern plains, but the events in prosperity had changed the course of her life. She had watched her father, a good but timid man, transform into a courageous leader, and she had been profoundly moved by the story of the man who had inspired him. She had decided to return to her hometown, to the place she had once been so desperate to escape. She had taken a job as the teacher in Prosperity's newly refurbished and now independent one-room schoolhouse. She had come to the mountain to thank Elias. But she had also come for another reason. The town, in its newfound prosperity, was still a rough, uncultured place. The children of the miners were bright and eager, but their world was small, their horizons limited. She had a vision for a new kind of school, a place that would not just teach them reading and arithmetic, but would teach them about the wider world, about science, about history, about the principles of justice and honor that Elias's story embodied. And she needed his help. She found him not in the cabin, but by the small, brilliant water wheel he had built, where he was making a repair to one of the wooden paddles. He looked up as she approached, his face a mixture of surprise and a quiet, guarded wariness. She told him who she was, and she told him her idea. "These children," she said, her voice full of a passionate, idealistic fire, "they need more than just a school. They need a future. You understand how the world works. You understand machines. You understand history. You understand the difference between right and wrong. I can teach them to read, but you can teach them how to think. You can teach them how to be builders, not just miners. You can teach them how to be citizens." Elias was a man who had turned his back on the world. He had no desire to be a teacher, a leader, a symbol. He wanted only to be left alone, to live out his days in the quiet, predictable rhythm of the mountain. He politely but firmly declined her offer. But Sarah Miller was a woman who had inherited her father's quiet, stubborn persistence. She did not argue. She simply started coming back once a week, making the long, arduous climb to the hidden valley. She would bring him a small loaf of fresh-baked bread, a recent newspaper, a new book from the school's small library. She would sit with him and Silas and she would talk. She would tell them about her students, about their small triumphs, their struggles, their bright, curious questions. She would ask Elias for his advice on a broken stove, on a lesson plan about geology, on a dispute between two of her older students. She was, in her own quiet, strategic way, laying a siege to his solitude. She was not asking him to come down to her world. She was bringing her world to him. She was showing him that the fight he had started was not over, that the community he had saved still needed him, not as a ghost or a legend, but as a living, breathing part of its future. Slowly, reluctantly, Elias found his walls of reserve beginning to crumble. He found himself looking forward to her weekly visits, to the sound of her intelligent, passionate voice, to the news of the world below, a world that was, whether he liked it or not, still a part of him. He began to offer his advice, to sketch out diagrams for a new irrigation system for the school's garden, to suggest books for her history lessons. He was becoming a teacher, a mentor in spite of himself. The turning point came one winter afternoon. A fierce early blizzard had swept through the mountains, and Sarah, who had made her weekly climb, was stranded at the cabin. The storm raged for 3 days, burying the valley under 4 feet of snow. They were trapped, the three of them, in the small, warm, and surprisingly comfortable world of the log cabin. It was during this forced, intimate confinement that Elias began to see Sarah not just as a determined idealist, but as a woman of profound strength, of quiet, unadorned beauty, of a deep, abiding kindness. He saw the way she cared for the old, irascible Silas, her patience and her gentle humor slowly breaking through his hermit's shell. He saw the passion in her eyes when she spoke of her students, her fierce, unwavering belief in their potential. And she, in turn, saw him not as a legend, not as a hero, but as a man who was scarred, both physically and emotionally, by the traumas of his past, a man who was brilliant and honorable and profoundly, deeply lonely. They were two people who had been shaped by the same small, hard town, two people who shared a deep, unspoken understanding of its struggles and its strengths. In the quiet, snowbound intimacy of the cabin, a new, unexpected and powerful connection began to grow between them. When the storm finally broke and the path down the mountain was clear, Elias made a decision. He would not go down to the town. Not yet, but he would no longer hide from it. "I will help you with your school, Sarah," he said, as she prepared to leave. "From here, I will build what you need. I will write your lessons. I will be your long-distance partner." And so began a new, strange, and wonderful chapter in the life of Elias Washington. He became the hidden, secret benefactor of the Prosperity Schoolhouse. From his mountain workshop, he designed and built a series of brilliant, innovative teaching tools. He built a working model of a steam engine to teach the children about the Industrial Revolution. He built a small, water-powered generator, a miniature version of his own, to bring the first electric light to the schoolhouse. He built a powerful shortwave radio, and he would hold a weekly radio class, his disguised voice crackling over the airwaves, teaching the children about the principles of geology, of engineering, of the wider world that lay beyond their small mountain valley. He was a ghost, a disembodied voice, a mysterious, unseen force for good. The children who knew the legend of the Ghost of Prosperity came to call their mysterious radio teacher the Professor. They had no idea that the hero who had saved their parents' lives was now the same man who was shaping their own futures. Elias had found a new kind of purpose. He was not a soldier anymore. He was not a miner. He was a builder, a teacher, a man who had found a way to serve his community, to fulfill his duty on his own terms. He had found a way to be a part of the world without being consumed by it. And his weekly visits from Sarah continued, no longer as a petition, but as a partnership. Their shared work, their shared vision for the town's future, deepened their connection, their respect, their affection for each other. The ghost of the mountain, the man who had thought his life was over, was slowly, quietly, and miraculously falling in love. He had found, in this hidden valley, not just a sanctuary, but a new reason to live. He had been abandoned, left to die. But in this forgotten place, with this remarkable woman, he was, at last, truly and completely found. The partnership between Elias, the ghost of the mountain, and Sarah, the teacher in the valley, became the quiet, beating heart of Prosperity's renaissance. The small schoolhouse was transformed. It was no longer just a place for learning the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. It became a laboratory of ideas, a hub of innovation, a place where the children of miners were learning to dream beyond the confines of the coal seams that had defined their parents' lives. Elias's radio lessons were the highlight of the week. The children would gather around the large, beautifully crafted shortwave radio he had built, their faces a mixture of awe and intense concentration, as the professor's deep, calm voice filled the room. He did not speak down to them. He spoke to them as fellow engineers, as future scientists. He explained the principles of hydraulics by describing the mine's water pumps. He taught them about geology by using the very mountain that surrounded them as his textbook. He taught them about history, not as a series of dry, distant dates, but as a story of human struggle, evil, of injustice, and of the quiet, courageous fight for a better world. He was giving them not just knowledge, but a new way of seeing their own world, a sense of their own place in a larger story. The tangible results of his work were everywhere. The small, water-powered generator he had designed not only lit the schoolhouse, but it also powered a small workshop he had helped Sarah set up, a place filled with tools and workbenches where the older students could learn the practical hands-on skills of carpentry and mechanics. The boys, who had once been destined for a short, brutal life in the mines, were now learning to build, to create, to repair. They were learning the skills of self-sufficiency, the language of a world that was not just about extraction, but about creation. And it was not just the boys. Elias, through his conversations with Sarah, had come to understand the deep, often invisible strength of the town's women. He designed a series of lessons and projects specifically for the girls, teaching them about the science of botany through the school's garden, about chemistry through the practical arts of soap making and food preservation. He was, in his own quiet way, a revolutionary, planting the seeds of a new idea in this traditional patriarchal town. The idea that a woman's mind was as valuable as a man's, that her potential was not limited to the domestic sphere. Sarah was the crucial, indispensable link in this chain. She was the one who translated his disembodied ideas into practical classroom reality. She was the one who nurtured the sparks of curiosity he ignited, who encouraged the students who struggled, who celebrated the small daily victories. She and the professor became a legendary, almost mythical team. Their weekly meetings in the Hidden Valley were the creative engine of this transformation. Sarah would make the long climb, her satchel filled with her students' work, with their questions, with her own new ideas. They would spend the afternoon in Elias's workshop, a space that was now a marvel of rustic, ingenious engineering, planning the next week's lessons, designing the next project. Their conversations were a lively, passionate, and deeply joyful exchange of ideas. And in the quiet hours after their work was done, as they sat by the fire in the small log cabin, their conversation would turn to more personal matters. Their friendship, which had been born of a shared, idealistic purpose, had slowly, quietly, and inevitably deepened into love. It was a love that was as solid, as patient, and as deeply rooted as the mountain itself. They were two scarred, solitary souls who had, in each other, found a home. But their idyllic, secret world could not last forever. Old Silas, who had been a silent, benign, and almost parental presence in their lives, was growing frail. His body was failing, his mind beginning to wander. He needed more care than Elias could provide alone in the isolated valley. And Sarah, who had now been the town's beloved teacher for over 5 years, was being urged by the school board to take on a new, expanded role as the district's first ever superintendent, a position that would require her to be based in the larger county seat. They were at a crossroads. The separate, parallel lives they had been leading were no longer sustainable. They had to make a choice. To stay on the mountain would be to abandon their shared work and to abandon Silas to a fate he did not deserve. To go down into the valley would mean that Elias, the ghost, the legend, would have to finally, fully re-enter the world. The decision was forced upon them one evening when Silas, in a moment of confusion, wandered out of the cabin and fell, breaking his hip. It was a serious, life-threatening injury. Elias, with his rudimentary knowledge of mountain medicine, knew that he could not treat it. Silas needed a real doctor, a hospital. For the second time in his life, Elias used his radio to call for help. He radioed down to the town's new clinic, and within an hour, a team of miners, led by a young, strong foreman Miller, the son of his old friend, was making its way up the mountain, following a trail of signal fires Elias had lit. They carried the old prospector down on a makeshift stretcher, their movements gentle and respectful, and Elias, his face a grim mask of resolve, packed a single small bag and walked down with them. The ghost was leaving the mountain. His arrival in prosperity was not the sensational, disruptive event he had feared. The town, had changed. He was not a spectacle, he was a neighbor, a man who was known and respected, even in his absence. They had known, of course, that he was up there. His partnership with Sarah was the town's favorite, open secret. His return was seen not as a resurrection, but as a homecoming. He and Sarah were married a month later, a simple, quiet ceremony attended by the entire town. They did not move into a new house. They moved into the old schoolhouse, which the town, as a wedding gift, had helped them to expand and to renovate, turning it into a beautiful, spacious, and deeply personal home, a place that was both a private sanctuary and a public trust. Silas, after a long, slow recovery at the clinic, came to live with them. He was a cantankerous, difficult, and deeply beloved member of their new, unconventional family. He would sit on their porch, a permanent grizzled fixture, telling tall tales of his prospecting days to the endless stream of children who were drawn to the house as if by a magnetic force. Elias, at first, was a man adrift in this new, louder, more complicated world. He was no longer a ghost, no longer a disembodied voice. He was a husband, a stepfather to the entire town's children, a citizen. He took a job, at Sarah's insistence, as the school's official engineer-in-residence, a title they had invented for him. He built a new, larger workshop on the school grounds, and it became his kingdom, a place of whirring gears and brilliant, practical magic. He did not just teach the children anymore. He began to teach the men, the miners who had spent their lives in a world of brute force and dangerous blind obedience, began to come to him in the evenings. He taught them the principles of mechanics, of safety, of engineering. He was giving them not just new skills, but a new kind of power, the power of knowledge, the power to understand and to control their own environment. He was, in his own quiet way, transforming the town's relationship with the mountain. It was no longer a thing to be feared, a beast to be plundered. It was a system to be understood, a source of power to be harnessed. He designed a new, more efficient ventilation system for the mine, one that dramatically improved the air quality and the safety of the workers. He helped the town to build a small, community-owned hydroelectric plant, a larger, more sophisticated version of his own first water wheel, which provided the town with cheap, clean and reliable power, freeing them forever from the grip of the regional utility monopolies. Elias Washington, the man who had been buried alive by a mountain, was now the man who was teaching his community how to harness that same mountain's power for their own collective good. He had been a man who had sought only to be free from the world, but in the end, he had found a deeper, more profound kind of freedom, the freedom to build a better world right where he was. He was not a ghost anymore. He was a builder, a husband, a teacher, a leader. He was a man who had been abandoned, left for dead, but who had found in a forgotten schoolhouse, in the heart of a remarkable woman, and in the bright, hopeful faces of a new generation, a place that had finally and completely changed everything. The schoolhouse, once just a simple single-room building, became the vibrant, thriving heart of the new prosperity. It was more than just a place where children learned to read and write. It was the town's community center, its library, its engineering lab, and its social hub. The home that Elias and Sarah had built within its walls was a place of constant, joyful, and purposeful activity. Its doors always open, its kitchen table always surrounded by a lively, rotating cast of students, miners, and neighbors. Elias, the engineer in residence, was the quiet, gravitational center of this new universe. His workshop became a legend, a place of wonder for the children and a place of practical, transformative learning for the men. He had a unique, powerful gift for teaching. He could take the most complex principles of physics or mechanics and explain them in simple, elegant, and deeply practical terms. He taught with his hands, with diagrams sketched on a piece of scrap wood, with a quiet, Socratic method that encouraged his students to discover the answers for themselves. He was teaching them more than just how to repair an engine or to design a better pulley system. He was teaching them a new way of thinking. He was giving them the tools of logic, of reason, of systematic problem solving. He was demystifying the world for them, showing them that the forces that governed their lives, whether the mechanics of a machine or the economics of a company town, were not mysterious, uncontrollable powers, but systems that could be understood, analyzed, and with courage and ingenuity changed. Sarah, now the district superintendent, was the architect of this educational revolution. She took the model they had created in Prosperity and began to expand it to the other small, isolated mining and logging towns in the county. She fought for funding. She recruited and trained a new generation of teachers. She built a curriculum that was a radical, powerful blend of traditional academics and the kind of practical, hands-on, problem-solving education that Elias had pioneered. Together, they were a formidable, unstoppable force for change. They were not just building a school, they were building a new kind of society in the hard, forgotten corners of the mountains, a society that was based on the principles of knowledge, of self-sufficiency, and of a deep, abiding respect for the dignity and the potential of every individual. Their life together was a seamless, beautiful blend of their shared work and their deep, private love. They were partners in every sense of the word, their strengths perfectly complementing each other. Sarah was the passionate, articulate, and tireless advocate, the one who fought the political battles in the world below. Elias was the quiet, steady, and brilliant innovator, the one who provided the practical, ingenious solutions, the one who kept the home fires, both literal and metaphorical, burning. Old Silas lived with them for 5 more years, a cherished, irascible, and deeply beloved grandfather to the entire town. His passing was a moment of profound, communal sadness, a final definitive closing of a chapter in the mountain's history. They buried him on a high, sun-drenched ridge overlooking the hidden valley where he had lived his solitary life, a place that Elias and Sarah would continue to visit, a quiet, sacred touchstone to the past that had brought them together. As the years passed, the legend of Elias Washington, the ghost of prosperity, began to fade, replaced by the quiet, tangible reality of Mr. Washington, the teacher, the engineer, the respected town elder. The dramatic story of his survival and his return was a tale told to the tourists who now came to the revitalized and surprisingly picturesque mountain town. But for the people of Prosperity, his true legacy was not in that dramatic, almost mythical past. It was in the bright, confident faces of their children, in the safe, efficient workings of the mine, in the steady, unwavering glow of the lights from their community-owned power plant. One day, a letter arrived at the schoolhouse. It was from a historian at a major university, a man who was writing a book about the history of the American labor movement. He had stumbled upon the story of the Atlas coal mine and the fall of Bartholomew Thorne, and he wanted to interview Elias. Elias, who had consistently and politely refused all such requests for decades, was, to Sarah's surprise, willing to meet with this one. The historian, a young, earnest, and deeply respectful man, came to Prosperity and spent a week with them. He sat in Elias's workshop. He interviewed the old miners. He pored over the town's records. On his final day, he sat with Elias and Sarah on their porch, his notebook filled with the details of a story that was even richer and more complex than he had imagined. "It's an incredible story, Mr. Washington," the historian said, his voice full of a genuine academic awe. "A story of a single, courageous man who brought down a corrupt and powerful system, a classic David and Goliath tale." Elias was silent for a long moment, a slow, thoughtful smile on his face. "With all due respect, son," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "you've got the story wrong." The historian looked at him, confused. "Wrong? How?" "It wasn't a story about one man," Elias said, his gaze drifting to the town, to the school, to the faces of the children playing in the yard. "And it wasn't about bringing a man down. That was just the clearing of the ground. The real story, the important story, is about what happened next. It's about what we all built together on that cleared ground. It's a story about a community that learned how to build its own house." He looked at Sarah, and the love that passed between them was a quiet, powerful, and deeply moving thing. And it's a story about a man who thought he was a ghost, a man who had forgotten how to live, and about a woman who came up a mountain and reminded him that the greatest, most important thing any of us can ever build is a home. The historian was silent, his pen still. He was a man who dealt in facts, in dates, in the grand impersonal narratives of history. But in that moment, he understood that he had been given a gift, a glimpse into a truth that was deeper and more profound than any historical record. He had been given the heart of the story. The book he wrote, The Ghost of Prosperity, a story of justice and community in the American West, became a national bestseller. It was not just a history of a labor dispute. It was a powerful, moving, and deeply inspiring story about the resilience of the human spirit, about the power of a community to heal itself, and about the quiet, transformative love of two remarkable people. Elias and Sarah lived out the rest of their long, happy lives in the schoolhouse, the beloved, revered, and slightly eccentric heart of the town they had, in their own quiet, unassuming way, saved. They were a testament to the profound and often paradoxical truth that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the deepest, darkest places. That sometimes a place that is meant to be a tomb can, in fact, become a cradle, and that sometimes a man who has been abandoned by the world can, in the most unlikely and forgotten of places, find the one thing that truly matters: a reason to build a new one. Elias Washington had been left to die in a mountain, but it was in that same mountain that he had finally, truly, and completely learned how to live. Your generous support through Super Thanks ensures that the flame of these powerful memories of hope and the triumph of the human spirit will never be extinguished. Thank you. The final chapter of Elias Washington's life was not written in the dramatic language of survival and reckoning, but in the quiet, steady prose of a long and fruitful peace. The years, like the mountain stream he had once harnessed, flowed on, carving new, gentle patterns into the landscape of prosperity and into the lines on his own face. The town he had returned to as a ghost, he now inhabited as its cornerstone, a quiet, unassuming, and deeply beloved patriarch. The schoolhouse was no longer just a school or a home. It was a living institution, a testament to the community's transformation. It had grown, wing by careful wing, into a proper K-12 school, its classrooms filled with the grandchildren of the men Elias had once mined alongside. The workshop he had built was now a fully equipped vocational center named the Elias Washington Technical Annex, a title that always made him shake his head with a quiet, humble amusement. The professor, the disembodied voice that had once crackled over a shortwave radio, was now a daily presence, a stooped, silver-haired man with a gentle smile and hands that could still, with a surgeon's precision, diagnose a faulty engine or explain the elegant logic of a cantilever bridge. He and Sarah grew old together, their love a quiet, constant, and nourishing presence in the heart of the town. They were a perfect, indivisible unit, their life a seamless partnership. He was the quiet, thoughtful dreamer, the man who saw the world in terms of systems and structures. She was the passionate, practical doer, the woman who translated his visions into budgets, lesson plans, and a functioning, thriving community. Their home was the town's living room, a place of warmth, of intellectual curiosity, and of a simple, unwavering decency that was the true north of their new world. One brilliant, crisp day in October, a day when the mountain was ablaze with the fiery gold and scarlet of the aspens, a sleek, modern car, a vehicle of a kind rarely seen in Prosperity, made its way up the winding mountain road and pulled up in front of the schoolhouse. A young woman in a sharp, professional suit stepped out. She was in her late 20s, her face bright with an intelligence and a confidence that seemed to radiate from her. She paused for a moment, looking at the school, at the town nestled in the valley below, a slow, fond smile spreading across her face. Elias and Sarah were sitting on their porch, as they often did in the afternoons. Elias looked up, his old, sharp eyes squinting against the sun. "Well, I'll be," he said, a slow, pleased smile spreading across his own face. "Look what the wind blew in." The young woman walked up the path, her steps sure and certain. "Professor Washington," she said, her voice a warm, respectful greeting. "Mrs. Washington, it's good to be home." It was Maria Sanchez, one of the first children to have sat in the one-room schoolhouse and listened to the crackling voice of the professor on the radio. She'd been a small, shy girl, the daughter of a miner, a child who'd been destined for a life of domestic servitude. But she had a mind that was as sharp and as clear as a diamond. Elias had seen it immediately. He had taken her under his wing, had nurtured her fascination with numbers and with structures, had told her, with his quiet, unshakable authority, that her mind was a gift and that she had a duty to use it. Maria had been the first student from Prosperity to go to a state university on a scholarship that Elias and Sarah had quietly, anonymously funded. She had studied civil engineering, and she was now one of the lead engineers on a massive statewide infrastructure project, building the bridges and the dams that were bringing a new kind of prosperity to the entire region. She sat with them on the porch for hours, talking about her work, about her life in the city, her voice full of the easy confidence of a person who knows her own worth, who is at home in the world. She unrolled a set of complex, beautiful blueprints on the porch railing. They were the plans for a new bridge she had designed, a graceful, elegant suspension bridge that was to span a deep, treacherous canyon. "I thought of you when I was working on this, Professor," she said, her finger tracing the intricate web of cables and supports. "I was trying to solve a problem, a question of load distribution and harmonic resonance. And I remembered a lesson you taught us a long, long time ago about the spiders in your workshop. You showed us how a spider's web, with its delicate interconnected threads, was one of the strongest structures in nature, how its strength wasn't in its individual parts, but in the way they all worked together, sharing the load. That's the principle I used here." She looked at him, her eyes shining with a deep, profound gratitude. "You didn't just teach us about gears and levers, Professor. You taught us a way of seeing the world. You taught us that we weren't trapped. You taught us that we could build our own way out." Elias was a man who was uncomfortable with praise. He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He looked at this brilliant, confident young woman, and he saw not just one of his former students. He saw the living, breathing embodiment of his life's true work. He saw the future he had helped to build. After Maria had left, her car a disappearing speck on the road that led back down to the wider world, Elias and Sarah took a walk, their evening ritual. They walked through the town, their steps slow, their hands clasped. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and autumn leaves. The lights were coming on in the houses, a warm, steady glow from the power plant that was the town's collective pride. They walked to the edge of the town, to the place where the old, sealed entrance to the Atlas mine still stood. It was no longer a place of menace, of trauma. It was a historical site, a monument to a past that felt a world away. The great concrete seal was now covered in a thick green carpet of ivy, and wildflowers grew in the cracks. The earth, in its own slow, patient way, was healing the scar. They stood there for a long time, in the fading light, looking at the sealed tomb. Elias felt the familiar phantom ache in his leg, a quiet reminder of the darkness, of the pain, of the rage that had once consumed him. He had been a man who had been defined by what had been done to him, a man haunted by a great injustice. But as he stood there now, with Sarah's hand warm in his, with the sound of his former student's grateful words still echoing in his mind, he felt not the ghost of his past, but the solid, peaceful reality of his present. He was not the ghost of prosperity. He was the husband of Sarah, the teacher of Maria, the elder of a community that had been reborn. "You know," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble, "I spent so many years thinking of this mountain as my enemy, the thing that tried to bury me. Then I thought of it as my sanctuary, the place that hid me. But I was wrong both times." He looked up at the great, silent peak, its summit now glowing with the last golden light of the setting sun. "It was never the mountain," he said. "It was just the men. The mountain. The mountain was just a place. It had the poison, but it also had the cure. It had the darkness, but it also had the light. It all just depended on what you were willing to build with it. It was the simplest and the most profound of truths. He had been abandoned to die, a worthless asset in a rich man's ledger. But in a forgotten, hidden place, he had found not just the means to survive, but the purpose for a new, better, and more meaningful life. He'd found the raw materials of his own courage, of a community's hope, of a good woman's love, and he had built a world. They walked back to the schoolhouse as the first stars began to appear in the deep, velvet sky. They sat on their porch, in the comfortable, familiar silence of their long love. He was an old man now, his body scarred, his life a long, unlikely journey. But as he sat there, in the heart of the home he had built, surrounded by the quiet, peaceful hum of the community he had helped to heal, Elias Washington, the soldier, the miner, the ghost, the professor, was, at last, completely and profoundly at peace. He had been left for dead in the darkness, but he had spent the rest of his long and honorable life building a world of light. Your generous support through Super Thanks ensures that the flame of these powerful memories of hope and the triumph of the human spirit will never be extinguished. Thank you.